It's good to see you all once again. I invite you to take a Bible and meet me in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4 will be there in just a few moments. A couple things, just a reminder, keep in mind those on the prayer list. Marla sent out a thing out this afternoon. Ileana's home now, but still struggling with that, so be praying for her. Be praying for those who have kind of ongoing issues, a lot of pain. It's good to see Chris out here tonight, but that sciatica pain is very, very painful, and so be keeping him in your prayers too for some relief there. And be sure to use that prayer list that was sent out this afternoon. Just keep those people in your prayers this week. I forgot to send out tomorrow. The monthly latest class will be meeting this Thursday, 10 a.m. at the Steve and Lynn Cook home. We'll send more information out either tomorrow or Tuesday, whenever I get to it. So, appreciate you all being here. Tonight, we want to be talking about, I thought it was maybe a good idea to talk about just the idea of what it means to rest. In our culture, I think this is something that lately has been given a lot of attention. I think needed attention. The kind of the fun phrase everyone wants to use is work-life balance, and some of us chuckle and go, what's that? But this idea of, I think our society is reckoning with is you can't work infinite amount of hours. There has to be a balance to that. There has to be some time to rest. And if we look at the data, I found some interesting things from Gallup and some other places. If you look on the whole, we as a country do not know how to take a break. For example, according to Gallup, 49% of Americans report frequently feeling stressed. Now, I didn't have time to dig in all the metadata on that, but that's from Gallup. And it's not just stress occasionally, but a little stress is good. That puts some pressure on, got to get some deadlines done, but frequently feeling stressed is not a good thing. And that's up since Gallup started keeping track of this. This is up, I think, 14 percentage points since they began in the early 2000s. So it's not getting better. 57% of Americans report not getting enough sleep at night. And enough is either the 8 hours. There was a larger group that said that they were from 5 to 6. But there was kind of a shocking number. About a quarter of Americans surveyed are getting 5 or less hours of sleep at night. And I'm not here to lecture on health, because I have those nights too, but lack of proper sleep has been linked to bad oral health, heart issues, high blood pressure, whole bunch of bad things. 55% of Americans report not using all their paid time off each year. Now let's put that in different numbers. That's 768 million PTO days that get left unused, or $65.5 billion in just benefits that Americans aren't using. At a more practical level, too, when we think about maybe just personality types, I remember going on family vacations. My mom and dad have completely two different definitions of what vacation is. I remember when we went to Hawaii one time, my dad came with one agenda item and one agenda item only, to sit on the beach and do nothing. And my mom shows up with an itinerary of all the places we have to see. And I can hear my dad go now, Tonette, if I wanted a tour, I would pay for a tour. There's two different ideas here what resting is. And unfortunately, sometimes I'm a little column A and column B. But this is one of those areas where, oddly enough, one of the things we can do to be the unique people of God is actually not only value rest, but know how to rest well. We're going to come back to Hebrews 4. I think Hebrews 4 is a very interesting passage, but in the Hebrew are talking about the Sabbath of the Old Covenant and the creation week of God, and when he rested from his labors, and how God and the prophet says that these disobedient people shall not enter my rest, the Hebrew writer makes the point in verse 9 that there remains, therefore, a rest for the people of God. That we are actively working towards in our lives to that ultimate rest that we are anticipating. And so I would say rest is a pretty important thing to God when done properly. Because in creation and how God ordered this world, God gave us rest as a gift. And he did that because work is not the ultimate purpose in our life. We do not exist here on this earth to work endlessly ad nauseum as our ultimate aim. In fact, we could survey the whole book of Ecclesiastes, but I want us to consider a few points here that Solomon brings up about what happens when we make work the end-all be-all of our existence. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 17 of many passages that Solomon talks about this, talking about all he did in his life, trying to find ultimate meaning and pleasure apart from God. He said, I explored knowledge, a wanton pleasure in my body. I was industrious. He built all sorts of things. And he says in verse 17, that what was the result of all that labor, all that toil? He said, therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for the wind. God gave us work to do, make no mistake. When he created Adam and Eve, before sin entered the world, he said, cultivate the garden and keep it. There's a proper place for labor. But when we get the priority askew and we make labor the main thing, we end up being where Solomon ends up. We end up going, all is vanity, what's the point? And it's toilsome, and it's troublesome, and it's distressing. You know, he says in chapter 3, we're not going to read this whole section, but there's a time for everything. Going down those first 8 verses, and if you need to memorize that, well, there's a song by the Byrds that can help you do that. There's a time for everything under the sun, which means there's a time for work, there's a time for pleasure, there's also a time for rest. Rest reminds us that we don't exist here just to work. For he says in verses 9 through 13, what profit has the worker from that which he is in his labors? I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He also has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God has done from beginning to end. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat, drink, and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. So what's the difference between this paragraph we just read in verse 17? Verse 17 is the person who doesn't have the priorities straight, who lives only to work and works to live. What we just read in 9 through 12 is the person who understands that work is good, but it's not all that there is. That it is also good and right to enjoy the blessings and the fruits of your labor in this life because it is the gift from God. And how do you enjoy those fruits? How do you enjoy the blessings? It's in your rest. It's in the time off. It's in the time that you have to enjoy those things that God has blessed you with. You know, I probably will use maybe one too many preacher illustrations tonight, but I've had a lot of older preachers talk to me about this balance of working in the kingdom and making sure you have time to enjoy yourself and enjoy your family. There is probably countless older preachers, including Brother Haley, who would give the advice, do not get so busy saving the world that you neglect your family and lose your kids. Because Brother Haley had several children, not a single one of them were faithful. It's because he was always off preaching. The Shropshires were a large preaching family in Oregon. Ben Shropshire Sr. helps establish many of those churches, and his son Jim had told me that when he was helping his dad write his memoirs, it was like pulling teeth just to get his dad to mention the birth dates of his children. You can overdo it on a good thing and miss the blessings that God has given. And children are a blessing from the Lord, says the psalmist. But how do you get to enjoy that privilege of raising children if you're never around to enjoy them? Rest reminds us and helps us enjoy those things. God gave us rest because it's a way to honor Him. In the Ten Commandments, and we're not underneath this law, mind you, but God gave this commandment of rest, not just for individuals, but whole families, down to the children, down to the animals that you owned, down to the land, as a way to honor Him. And back in Hebrews chapter 4, we see that the Hebrew writer pulls in the creation week here. It says in verse 4, He has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all His works. Now, there's two ways, I think there's two ways we honor God when we do rest. Now, the Old Covenant people, one way they honored God by observing the Sabbath was, God said so. You show your respect for God when you do what He says. That's one level. Now, you and I, it's where we're the same as the Old Covenant people. You and I show the same respect for God when we rest, because that's what God did when He was done with His creative labors. See, that's one of the interesting things about being made in the image of God. Why God never does tire. He set an example for us even in the week of creation when He rested on the seventh day. God showed us, even though God never tires and never has to stop, that it's good to take a break. And while God is still actively working on our behalf and so forth, we do honor God's creation and the pattern, the example He's left us when we do take that time to rest from our own labors. Again, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, there's a time for all of that. And this maybe seems like a weird point, but it's also a way to be different. So currently, you'll hear advice given to young men, and I think some of it's misguided. In fact, I would probably say a lot of it is misguided, but that's a different story. One of it says I've heard this advice recently, as a young 20-year man, you should work as hard as you can to see where the absolute limits are of your physical capacity is. That sounds like a recipe for burnout. Young men should be working 80 plus hours a week. And again, that sounds like a recipe for burnout. Now, there are some jobs that demand that. I get that. My choir director, how he got through college was he worked the oil fields in Wyoming. And you worked like 6 on, and then you were off for 5 or something like that. And it was long, arduous days. But no, it's funny about those really arduous, laborious jobs where you're working like 5 10s, or you have the 2 weeks on. Normally there's more rest after that. People who work 4 10s get 3 days off instead of the 2 when people work the 5 8-hour days. You see, there's a balance there. But in a culture right now that is obsessed with the hustle, the grind of not only do I have my job, but I have this side hustle and this side hustle. I'm working all these things, and in my free time, my side hustle's got side hustles. I'm working and working and working. One of the ways the people of God show that they are different is that we do prioritize proper rest. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, starting in verse 22. In Ecclesiastes, the chapters 2 and starting in verse 22. Again, Solomon speaking from personal experience, he says, For what has man for all his labor and for his striving in his heart with which he has toiled under the sun. For all his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. Again, Solomon speaking about when we don't have our priorities straight. In many ways, Solomon is pointing out the error and the misstep that our culture is currently making. Even at rest, we can't help but think about work. And think back to that commandment of keep the Sabbath day holy. In an agrarian society, it was considered insane that you would take a day off, that everyone would take a day off. And granted, Israel did not always keep the law of God perfectly, far from it, and they didn't always keep the Sabbath the way they should have, because that comes up over and over again in the prophets, that they were not doing that. They were profaning the Sabbath. But God gave them the Sabbath for their good, to honor Him, and also as a marker of being God's people. While everyone else around them was working, on the Sabbath, they rested and they trusted in God's provision that taking that one day a week off wasn't going to put them behind everybody else. And I think about in my own travels, as a culture, we're suffering from this epidemic of busyness. And it's not good. It's one thing to be industrious and to be involved in good labor. But busyness is just that. It's a whole bunch of stuff that we fill our lives with that may or may not actually be good. And the reason I say this, I've preaching for 10 years, so I've preached my fair share of meetings, and I've just noticed, and I've talked to other preachers, the people of God have not been immune from letting the busyness take over our lives. What I mean by this in meetings, there have been some meetings where we get to Sunday morning and the attendance quadruples because everyone was just too exhausted and too busy for the weeknight. Or they're too busy, like, I don't have time to have anybody at my home, but I'll be there maybe. The real awkward one was Sunday morning when the song leader got up and led singing and says, and we meet tonight at 5 o'clock, and we'll see you all there when we conclude our meeting. And he and his family were not there that night, and there was no reason given. This is not me complaining per se. It's just things I have observed and heard from older Christians, that there has been a change in the attitudes of the people of God when it comes to what is worth our time and how we spend our time. And I think we're suffering from this culture of busyness where we're busy doing a whole bunch of nothing, really. And if it may step on some toes, so be it. Just things I've observed. Children do not need to be doing travel sports every single night of the week. They don't. And I read a really good article from a college athletic director who's against travel sports. We don't need to be involved in every single organization and group that we get invited to. If we're getting to a point where we're missing the connections with the people of God, if we're getting to the point where we're so busy and so exhausted from all of our other stuff that we're doing in life, that it's making us miss quality time with God's people, talking to our neighbors about the gospel, or just enjoying rest with our family, there's a priority issue. And on the flip side, I say for myself, even if we're busy doing all those good things, if it's making us to the point of exhaustion where we're neglecting other important things in our life, we have a problem with busyness, and maybe we're not resting enough. And we should rest, because it teaches us several important lessons. And I have 3 more points for you this evening, and then the lesson will be yours. We need to remind ourselves that when we rest teaches us that we're not God. Maybe we're wondering, why do we need that lesson? Well, sometimes, speaking for Brenden here, Maybe on some level I kind of think I am because, well, I remember early on, first year full-time preaching, I just made a comment to one of the elders. I said, yeah, I haven't taken a day off in probably 3 weeks because I had classes and I was studying and doing this and that and the other thing. And the reality was I was busy doing a whole bunch of nothing and I could have managed my time better. Rest reminds us that we're not infinite and we don't have unlimited energy. One of my favorite verses in Ecclesiastes, I'm going to cite it here. Normally I reference it in reverence to worship, but there the wisdom writer talks about, when you come to the house of God, come near to listen, not to offer the sacrifice of fools, because God is in heaven, you are on the earth. And that's the wisdom writer's reminder of we're not God. We don't have his powers. We don't have, he is limitless. We do have limits. And one of the things when we do take that time off, when we do rest, when we do recover and recuperate, at least for me, it's a good reminder that I can only do so much. And God's not asking me to do what I'm unable to do. He's asking me to do what I can. And along that point, when I make sure I'm fully rested, I actually serve my brethren and people in the world better. I think of the old Snickers commercials of you're not you when you're hungry. My favorite one was where Betty White's there and she's complaining about something and the guy hands him a Snickers like, you eat this real quick, and it turns into a very big, like 200-pound man. It's just like, the idea is when you're hungry or tired or cranky, you're not you. And I know when I don't rest, I get irritable, I get stressed, I don't do the quality work that I normally do. And unfortunately, that's a lesson I've had to learn not once, not twice, multiple times, and oftentimes the hard way. So when we rest, it reminds us of our own limitations, and also we need to keep in mind that when we rest well, it's so that we can continue to serve well. Secondly, rest reminds us that we need to rest. I want us to look in Mark chapter 6 here. You can be involved doing all the best things in the world, teaching people, serving people, but you eventually get to a point where you realize you got to take a break. I think of one account in Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 30. Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all the things, both what they had done and what they taught. And note what Jesus says. And he said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest for a while. For there are many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. I don't think anyone here tonight would say that the apostles were wasting their time. They were engaged in good work. Probably the best work any man could do because they're laying the foundation for the kingdom. They're teaching people. They're working right with Jesus. That's great stuff. But even Jesus saw that, okay, you need to rest for a while. You need to rest for a while. You need to recover. I have a book in my library. It's on preaching. And in the back of it was a sample schedule of what this author thought the preacher should be keeping. And I have the book because it has some good points on how do you make application in preaching, how do you put together a really good topical lesson. But I save the schedule because it's a good example of what not to do. This man was under the impression that the preacher should be getting up at 5 a.m. and should not be going home from work until probably 10 o'clock that night. Family time and relaxation time was allotted to an hour and a half on Saturdays between 2:45 p.m. and 3-something. Weeknight family time was limited to 45 minutes per weeknight. The rest of his time, visitation, showing film strips, teaching classes. And I would say to you that that kind of schedule is inhumanly possible to keep. And maybe there is a reason why many preachers' families over the years instead of coming to love and appreciate the church and the people of God, had anything but love for that. And I get it. It's hard to kind of do a post-op and the autopsy there, but unrealistic expectations of what people serving can do leads to burnout. And this idea that, well, he doesn't need to rest, or we don't need to rest, there's too much important work. No, the important work involves rest. Absolutely it does. The apostles needed to rest, even them doing the best work possible with Jesus. And finally, we need to remind ourselves that when we do take physical earthly rest, it's a foretaste of the rest that's to come. The bigger point that the Hebrew writer was making in chapter 4 is that he's pulling together these Old Testament texts about how God had sworn to the disobedient that they would not enter his rest. And the Hebrew writer concluded a couple things from that. One, there was still a rest remaining for us living in his day and today. That there is an ultimate rest that God has reserved for his people who are faithful to him. That's the big thrust of Hebrews 4. He pulls in on how the Sabbath of the Old Covenant pointed forward to this better and greater rest, and how Jesus secured it for us. Therefore, in 9 and 10, there remains therefore a rest for the people of God. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works as God did from his. And this is why in the Revelation, John wrote in chapter 14, verse 13, that those who die in the Lord from now on shall rest from their labors. And when Jesus said to the apostles and all who are listening, "Come unto me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I believe Jesus' promise was rest in this life, but also it points to the ultimate rest that is awaiting for us. And one of the things I enjoy doing on my days off is to go out to Sabino Canyon or someplace else like that. It is it's refreshing. I get a rest. I feel rejuvenated. But eventually, physical rest in this life does come to an end. Sunday evening comes around, and many of us still are working jobs we know we have to clock in tomorrow morning. And we get a little sad because the weekend's over. We have to go back to work. But I think there's a blessing in the fact that our rest here on earth is in many ways limited. It makes us long for the eternal final rest that is awaiting for us. I may be sad Sunday evening that I have to clock in tomorrow morning, but it also should remind me, like, hey, one day I'm not going to have to clock in anymore. One day I'm never going to have to worry about getting ready for work again. One day I'm not going to have to worry about the works and labors of this life. I'm going to have the perfect eternal rest that Jesus has promised. The perfect eternal Sabbath rest that God has reserved for those who are faithful to him. And so as we think about maybe our relationship with rest, our relationship with busyness and work, maybe this week we consider trying to carve out some actual time to rest. To take some time and just let ourselves recharge and recover, to think about the goodness of God, that he has given us the gift of rest in order to do that. He's designed our bodies in such a way that if we just get a couple hours a week, we can feel recharged. And let us strive to protect our time that we can indeed rest. I look out tonight and by appearance, I think I know your condition, but the reality is I don't know your heart and I don't know where you stand tonight with the Lord. If you have need to be baptized for remission of your sins, there's water ready, but I think the more pressing need tonight is if you have sin that needs repenting of and confessing, or you need prayers of encouragement and strength, we invite you to come as together we stand and sing the song that's been selected.